Thanks to the organizers for bringing me back to Singapore. The first time I came was in 2001, October. So different times. I have to say, I think it was also cheaper. Combination of world events probably led to that. But I also have a very good friend and co-author from Singapore, David Chor. So we always joke that we're the small open economy representatives, because I'm from Costa Rica. And I have to say that my Costa Rican-ness, when confronted with humidity, just means, yes, it cannot be tamed. So I allowed it to be free. So also, I want to thank the organizers for the opportunity to read this fantastic paper. And so let me just give an overview first of some of the arguments. So go back to 1939. So Hansen sees high unemployment, low inflation, even after some big Keynesian fiscal policies. And so the argument is, this has to be secular stagnation, a lack of demand for investment that is leading to these low interest rates. And what is the reason that we're observing this world is demographics. Older people just don't use a lot of capital. They use services, perhaps, if anything, and this is leading to this lack of demand. And it's interesting that at that time, this emphasis on goods and capital probably made sense, but I think this bias that we tend to continue to think that what creates growth and development is capital, I think has sustained and remains until now. So move forward, and then Bernanke explains it and revisits the argument, and he says, no, it was a financial crisis. The effects were long, but at the end of the day, temporary in the big scheme of things. Why? Is long because debt resolution is low. Adjustment of housing, which can be part of people's wealth, has implications in terms of consumption and other activities, and thus it's low. But on top of that, we tend to impose excessive regulation, and in the US that was a case. There was a lot of regulation to try to limit the effects of financial crisis, that limit banking lending to, in particular, small and medium firms. But there's also the political economy of how to redistribute the losses that also makes these processes very long. But at the end, eventually, growth and interest rates do pick up. So move forward, close to 75 years later, and Larry Summers, again, the same. He sees low growth despite expansionary policies, and so he says we're again in this phenomenon of secular stagnation, a lack of demand of investment, and again, capital and excessive savings. Add to that, then Blanchard says that we're in the world where interest rates are low, growth is higher than interest rates, and this becomes the rule rather than the exception, so we can safely expand government without a lot of worry, because growth is going to make everything fine in terms of sustainability. Then Rogoff comes and he says, no, it is a financial crisis. It is, again, very long, but it's, in the big scheme of things, also temporary. And why? Again, this process that he calls the debt supercycle that has the collapse of housing and equity prices that immediately led to the global financial crisis in the US. This problem in the US became a debt problem in Europe, and then in China, that in many ways saved emerging markets by increasing growth, was also due to a policy to do a lot of investment. Again, the policies associated to try to deal with the global financial crisis. And again, why this process is slow? The recovery is more V-shaped, is more long than V-shaped. It took 2 years just to stop GDP from sinking and to recover unemployment close to 5 years. But again, why so long is the same. It's the process of solving debt, the wealth effects from prices lead to collapse on consumption. Again, in the US, everyone, or most people had the wealth in housing. And thus, even though the US tends to have a very fast resolution of housing crisis, you just lose your house and you start again. That just meant that many people also couldn't move because the value of houses were going down. So this makes this process take a while, but as in the Great Depression, the US also imposed a lot of regulation to the banking system. This also had implications in terms of lending to small and medium firms. Again, this regulation overshoot capital requirements and again effects on the nominal interest rate. Why does this debate matter? Because if we are in the world of the mediocre growth due to lack of demand and investment, then interest rates will be low, growth will be low forever, and so we will be in a world of low growth, low neutral rates, and low inflation. Monetary policy has the lower bound problem, and so we need asymmetric frameworks to try to deal with this lower bound problem, higher targets, and come up with creative solutions, because the standard way we think about monetary policy doesn't work. But to compensate, we don't have to worry about fiscal policy. Fiscal policy can be expansionary ad infinitum, and we should use it to stimulate demand and should not worry about debt sustainability. But what if we are in the other world? Well, if we are in the other world, if we are in a debt supercycle, eventually growth and interest rates will pick up. And so if the decline in interest rates was due to financial crisis, we're going to see a very quick drop and sharp drop in demand and interest rates. But again, it's temporary, in this case, close to 10 years. But eventually, we will go back to normal, neutral interest rates, or at least a return to the initial trend. And so that means we need to be a little bit more careful how we're doing monetary policy, because it is, in a way, monetary policy as usual. It needs to be symmetric. We should target increases the same way as we target decreases to fight inflation. If we wrongly believe we're in secular stagnation, then we will have excessive loose monetary policy and high inflation. And again, we need to worry because we might be creating these surprise inflations to create these fiscal adjustments. Being from Latin America, I have to say to the first presenter, the people not only hate the high level, they also hate the inflation because they do know that it's also constantly eroding different forms of assets. But in fiscal policy, then we also need to worry about sustainability, because as Ken Rogoff mentioned at the end of the talk, what we're doing now in fiscal policy may be creating the seed for the next problem. That will be high debt with serious sustainability problems. And so, as always, an insightful paper. I have to say that in this case, not only based on tons of paper with great collaborators, Carmen Reinhardt, Rossi, and others, but also based on centuries of data of research. And that, of course, makes this a very hard paper to discuss, but also is a very humbling academic research. I have to say that in a world where we look at academia, and I myself look now at the world with academia, with a little bit of sadness, I find this research to be a great, to give us hope about what academia should be. If you see the debates that Ken Rogoff and Larry Summers are having, which I call both of these researchers the gentlemen of research, but in the good way of what gentleman means, because they have very rigorous data theory-driven arguments to inform first-order questions: growth, unemployment, innovation. And the paper does discuss innovation. As I said, I think we tend to continue to have this bias that the only growth that matters is growth in goods and capital, and we forget about services and all the implications related. Ken Rogoff in the paper mentions AI, but there's all this other revolution that is happening in the world of medicine that is not only dealing with diabetes, but also obesity. My husband is from Brazil, and everyone calls it their Ozempic, as how they pronounce things in Brazil. But the potential that has to make high quality life for people as they're getting older, there's a reason why the value of the company is higher than Denmark. It's not only diabetes, obesity, it also has the potential to deal with addiction. So it can transform the way we live, but again, there's always this bias of looking for the road, the the train, the car, and it's coming in some other ways. But this paper also talks about demographics, where there is no correlation. We always have this Malthus fear. And again, the paper in the work that Ken Rogoff does with co-authors shows there's no correlation. Sometimes it's up, sometimes it's down, but it is not determinant. And again, we're all now fearing that there is less population growth, but we shouldn't fear it. There is ways in which we can make people live longer and happier and healthier. It also has implications, as I said, of how we conduct fiscal policy, financial policy, monetary policy, regulation, and in the bigger sense also how we deal with the international financial architecture. So again, as I said, I came to Harvard a long time ago, and I always have found both of these researchers, Ken Rogoff and Larry Summers, to be inspiring in the way they do research, but they have always been very great colleagues, willing to lend a hand. And so I felt a little bit that I had to choose. I had a little bit of a Sophie's Choice kind of moment. And I had to go with Ken on this one, because I just think the evidence is clear. Like, it's just very hard to debate centuries of research, and I'm sure Larry Summers, who indeed is a great debater, I think he won a debate when he was an undergrad, will find a way to make a comeback, but in this round I would give it to Ken, in part also because I am a child from the developing world, I'm a child from the debt crisis, and many of the arguments have a parallel in emerging market business cycles. There was also a discussion of how much this is productivity and shocks versus financial frictions. It was also solved with longer data, but also the debt dynamics in Latin America also showed a lot of these, why these processes take so long to be solved. Then, again, the paper has many topics. I just chose three brief comments. One is this on the comparisons with emerging markets. Second, I had a question of implications. I know Ken doesn't wanna do forecasts, but I think this is a question that people would like to know. Are they going to go up or down, and the process of how? And then I just wanted to learn a little bit more of his thoughts about the international financial architecture. I myself have been very critical of how a lot of recent programs have been implemented for Latin America, and I do think that they're creating the seed for the next problem. And this research sort of justifies some of their views, but I think I also think it's also bringing what we are seeing in many poorer countries. So let me start with these comparisons with emerging markets. There is a little bit of a research that is actually doing the similar discussion on whether the crisis in emerging market and business in emerging markets in general can be explained by a shock, a permanent shock with a lot of temporary shocks that affect TFP, or do we need something more, financial frictions, country risk premium and shocks? And here in the debate is Kinlan and Mark Aguirre and Gita Gopina. On the other side is Martin Uribe with co-authors. And what is interesting is the way Martin Uribe tried to solve this problem was precisely trying to bring longer data series, because we tend to get caught in the moment, and the moment could be either 10 years or 20 years. But again, these are very slow moving processes, so we do need a longer data set to try, and this is in the Ken's paper, not only to understand, but to estimate a lot of these parameters. Because the process is slow moving, the only way to do it is actually with more data. The econometrics just won't work if we don't have more data. And indeed, this is what is done. And so if you see Mexico, you do see the big drop in Mexico during the Great Depression. And again, it took a long time for it to come back. And you see also the big drop in Mexico after the global financial crisis. And again, if you know where for this, you would see a trend. Mexico had the particularity that the China shock hit Mexico the way it hit Ohio, let's say, it was. But you see now a trend in Mexico increasing, again, probably part of this reshoring and nearshoring. But again, these are very slow moving processes, but you do see a trend. The other one is Argentina, that has more volatility. as you can see, but there are two big crises. One was the bearing crisis in the 1910s. Actually, Argentina was not as hit by the Great Depression because of its role in the war, let's put it like that. But then you saw also the debt crisis that had the same big drop. And the discussion was the same in emerging markets. First, it was thought, no, let's do some structural reforms and maybe it will be enough, and that was the Baker Plan and a little bit of money. And it took a long time to get to the Brady Plan and the final resolution because it was a discussion of who's going to bear the costs of the adjustment, with a lot of the US banks not wanting to acknowledge the debts because they all would be bankrupt. So it was a slow process of them cleaning their balance sheets to be able to allow for the resolution. And eventually, when this resolution happened, growth resumed and it was successful in a lot of these countries. And you see there a plot of a lot of these countries in Latin America, which has a very similar performance to the Great Depression in some of the European countries. So again, the argument has not only built on data, but if you have studied, and I have studied through the eyes of Carmen and Kenneth, financial crisis, you do know that these processes just take a long time to recover. And so then, as I said, the argument is being done with data since 1300s. And you do see it in the data. There's some breaks in the data, the Black Death, and when you had Spain and France and Holland default. But other than that, you do see this very slow moving with a lot of variability. And that is what it makes it tricky. There is just a lot of variability. You can download their data. It's fantastic. You download it and you see everything. And so we played a little bit. We didn't have the same way of the trending, but you do get the same feeling of the same trend, and you do see the data has a little bit extra years, and so you can see the phenomenon of the global financial crisis. After that, there are no trends. If anything, you do see the stable and decreasing going down of the interest rate, 150 basis points, but it is true that the global financial crisis had a big dip of close to 300 basis points. And so that was one question. What is the number we're returning? What is the trend? So I play a little bit with the data. And again, this has a huge standard deviations. And so my playing with the data probably is not the best playing with the data. But you do get that it is forecasting that interest rates should be around 1%. And so 1% is actually a little bit lower than what we are now. That is, depending the number that he showed, it was a little bit 2 point something. And so then what is it that we're expecting? Is it going down or is it going up? And again, this is very hard to forecast because of the slow moving and the high variability. And there is the question, what was the biggest deviation? The interest rates above or before the global financial crisis or after the financial crisis? But it's still, what is the best guess of what's going to happen? I actually do think, and I agree with the paper, that it's going to increase. So we're still going to see more deviation toward going up. It's going to take a while before it goes down. And then the question is, of course, where is the next bubble building? And I actually do think it's the US. So in the paper, Ken Rogoff mentions that in the Jackson Hole, Aiken Green didn't want to commit, but there's this new paper that he wrote with Peter Henry and Artsplan for the Brookings, and they actually do commit in that paper. They're very pessimistic about the outlook of the US, not only because of the growth on the debt, but also because of the polarization in the US. I have to say, being from Latin America, the US has become populist all the way. It is a contest, who gets more money, who gets more pardons, who doesn't have to pay anything. And there's always this mythical billionaire that you can tax and pay for everything. And it is worrying, and it is both parties. This worry has had implications in terms of trade. As I said in other talks, it doesn't matter the 80-year-old that's going to be in charge of the US, tariffs are not gonna go back to what they were before 2017, but fiscal policy also seems to be having this Latin American moment. The other concern is not only the US, but there is debt distress in many emerging markets, which, by the way, was the outcome of the policies implemented during COVID. Again, this view that interest rate would be zero and we can just expand fiscal policy with no cost has meant that a lot of countries right now have very high debt levels and concerns about debt sustainability, also in this very polarized world environment. And so to conclude, I would like to know a little bit of his thoughts on the international financial architecture. As I said, I have been very critical. During COVID, there was like, just spend, and we'll worry about the future tomorrow, which is in a way a Keynesian, except that we don't tend all to die the next day, and so we do need to deal with it, and now we're dealing with it, and there's huge risks. And of course, the other one is China, which indeed, following the global financial crisis, and the graph shows there, did this change from export-led growth to try to use investment to stimulate the economy. And as I told my students, it's just very hard to find profitable projects that account for 50% of GDP for 20 years in a row. And with that, as always, always must read, critical research agenda about first-order questions. Thanks.
Can I invite Professor Andrew Rose to deliver his discussant remarks, please?
I've known Ken for a long time, 35 years. I'm an admirer, I'm a believer, I'm a consumer of his research, which means I'm also a longtime reader of his research, and that's going to be relevant going forward. Okay, to the paper. Who's afraid of secular stagnation? Okay, well, the answer is everyone should be. If you believe in secular stagnation, you have a bleak future in front of you. Now, as a business school dean, this particularly affects me. We have a strong preference in my particular profession for cliches and platitudes. We have to give trite bromides about VUCA progress and accelerating change. Secular stagnation would wipe all of that out. It would be a serious downer, okay? The big question from a purely economic point of view is the appropriate real interest rate. I will typically refer to R, the real interest rate, as just the interest rate. Is the real interest rate that's required to generate enough investment for full employment, is that actually technically feasible? Okay? And if not, then you get really low interest rates and low growth, and that's forever, and that's a real downer. Okay. The key stylized fact that motivates this is, of course, that the interest rate and the growth rate have been low recently for much of the 21st century, which we haven't had that much of course. The issue is, if you're in this, secular stagnation is forever. It's really persistent. So serious downer, okay. Debt resolution, which is the alternative hypothesis that Ken is pushing here, is, as Laura and Ken both said very clearly, transient. Okay, so this is something that really matters. It matters for both America, and I'm going to focus on America in just a second, and for the entire rest of the world. So the question arises, and that's what the paper is nominally about, which hypothesis seems right? Okay, next. This is, if you're into secular stagnation, primarily about America, because it's the frontier economy that's the relevant one for secular stagnation. If Singapore hit secular stagnation, it would be a drag for Singapore, but not a big deal for the entire world. But poorer countries always have catch-up growth as a potential. So this is really about America if you're into secular stagnation. America is also, of course, disproportionately important for a whole host of reasons, okay? It's a tremendous source of import demand for the rest of the world. It provides the reserve currency for the world. If you have a fixed exchange rate, chances are pretty high you fix to America. It provides lots of the financial plumbing, the payment system and financial institutions. It's the source of safe assets in the form of treasury bonds, and of course, lots of non-economic phenomena like the military. The most important country financially is almost always that with the largest navy. And that's probably America right now, though of course China's catching up. Okay, so evidence from other countries is not obviously relevant to this debate about secular stagnation versus an alternative hypothesis. So much as you might want to think Japan is highly relevant because of its enormous gross and also net debt, it's not at the frontier. Okay, so the debt supercycle is a completely plausible explanation, as Laura said very clearly, and as Ken has made the argument. Why have both the interest rate and growth been persistently low for a long period of time? Well, debt problems are just intrinsically slow to resolve. Banking systems take a long time to recapitalize. There are wealth effects that linger, and they affect consumers and, of course, many institutions. The negative effects on investment drag on. Financial policy often overshoots and becomes more restrictive, and that just exacerbates these problems. So the rationalization that Ken provides looking backwards over time looks completely plausible and reasonable to me. Okay, adding credibility are other characteristics of a debt supercycle. Okay, there was a very slow recovery from the global financial crisis, especially in unemployment. Okay, the magnitude of the housing boom and bust, very specific to a debt supercycle, you wouldn't necessarily expect with secular stagnation. The leverage that we saw during the bubble, the behavior of equity prices before and especially after the crisis. All of this stuff is adding credibility, the explosion of debt that we've seen. All of these enhance the scientific plausibility of Ken's basic hypothesis. And there are, of course, some of them are quite consistent. Most of them are pretty consistent with features of secular stagnation. Okay, so a note. I've known Ken for a long time. I've experienced some very black days with Ken, just as it turns out. So the Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989, which was a big deal, okay, we were actually sharing, as it turns out, Jeff Frankel's house at the same time. So that was a really bad time. Tuesday morning, September the 11th, I was working in the fund. I was one of the last people to tell Ken about the attack on the World Trade Center. So I've experienced some bad times with him, but nothing looks as bleak as the portrait looking forward here. If you thought those were bad times, which I did, the worst is yet to come, because there are fundamental reasons that he lays out why fiscal pressures are going to keep rates high for a long time yet. Now, Laura has already gone over these, so I'll just go over them briefly. But of course, as Ken said, debt levels start off very high right now. Demographic pressures, especially unfunded pension liabilities that Ken mentioned, but also health liabilities, those are going to be really important going forward for many, many countries. And most of them don't show up in debt yet because they're implicit. Okay? Deglobalization is just going to worsen the level of wealth for many of us and slow down growth. The green transition and climate change, as Ken said, that's going to place enormous fiscal pressures on governments all over the world. Increased defense spending because of geopolitical risks. Okay, so the last one, which is of special importance to many people, especially in America, are inequality and its manifestations in populism, which are just terrible. So you conclude from this extremely dire but probably realistic reading of the record, the fiscal burdens that we face are already burdensome and extremely risky and quite likely to get worse. So if you take this paper seriously, which I urge you to do, it's a real downer. Okay, a tangent. Singapore is one place that doesn't need a homily about the perils of debt. Okay, now, for those of you who don't know, Singapore actually has pretty high gross government debt, on the order of 160 percentage points of GDP, which might look awful, but that's an incredibly superficial look. Singapore also typically runs a balanced budget or a surplus. I looked at the data over the last 50 years. On average, Singapore has run a surplus of over 7 percentage points of GDP. So you might say, well, where's the debt come from? It issues debt deliberately in order to facilitate market development and to finance infrastructure. Okay? it has no net debt. It's a big net creditor. It's not the biggest net creditor in the world compared to GDP. That'd be Norway because of North Sea oil. But it's bigger than Switzerland, Saudi Arabia, Germany with a debt break, Japan, every one of these countries. Huge net creditor. And Singapore is enormously risk averse in many, many different facets. Okay, so here, Ken is just preaching to the converted. If you're a Singaporean and you remember the PAP, there's nothing to be learned about here whatsoever. Anyway, that's a tangent. Back to secular stagnation. There is no denying some of the key long-run features here. The demographic transition that's been talked about repeatedly, and there are different parts of this, of course, the decline in fertility and the increase in female participation, which is probably topped out at this point, the integration of China and emerging economies. I just want to mention, at least in passing, Bernanke's savings glut that sort of goes the same argument. The key thing, as has been pointed out by both Laura and Ken, is these are slow-moving phenomena. So the debt supercycle and secular stagnation, the alternative hypotheses for what explain what we see, they're not equally plausible. Timing is on Ken's side. The nominal and the real interest rates fall dramatically because of the global financial crisis, as you'd expect. They rise with inflation, whereas the forces driving secular stagnation are slow-moving. That's the key argument, and it's a complete winner as far as I'm concerned. Okay, so to me, much of the paper's motivation seems contrived. I just don't think there's a real debate here. Let me go on and talk about that. Who's on the other side of the debate from Ken? Well, it's not Larry Summers. Okay, so here's a quote from April, and Ken alluded to this, but let me read it out. If I had to guess, secular stagnation was a phase, and just like the people who thought it would return after World War II turned out to be wrong, those who think it will return after the pandemic turn out to be wrong. So he's not a believer anymore. Okay. As Ken said, flexible views. Okay, so fair enough. You know, you're supposed to adjust your views as the data change. Who is on the other side? Olivier Blanchard, one of my thesis supervisors. He strongly believes secular stagnation is not over. Okay, he wrote this book, pretty influential book, Fiscal Policy Under Low Interest Rates. And let me just read an excerpt from the preface. One final remark added as I read the galleys in June 2022. I finished writing the book at the end of 2021. Since then, inflation has increased and central banks are increasing nominal rates. Real rates are still extremely low, but they will rise further. As the readers will see, I had largely anticipated these evolutions and explained why I thought they might lead to a temporary bump in rates, but with a return to low real rates after that. I stand by these conclusions. Okay, so the debate is, as Laura pointed out very clearly, the difference between the real interest rate and the growth rate, R minus G. Okay, so, oh, I'm sorry, just in passing. Olivier reiterated these points in a blog post in January 2023, where he did a quantitative assessment of R minus G, and he thought R minus G was between minus 0.7% and minus 1.3% for the United States, which is the relevant country here. Okay, so you want to think about what's R and what's G. Okay, this is very unfortunate timing for Olivier. The CBO and many others think that the 10-year real US growth rate is about 2.2%. Let's not fixate, but that strikes one as completely plausible. Okay, fair enough. What about the real interest rate? Okay, so here's what the TIPS rate looks like. This is not the only measure, but it's certainly a super easy market-driven rate, and it's right now at almost exactly 2.2%. There's a graph of it going back. It's almost exactly the same one that Ken used. Okay, I don't want to ask the question about where it's going in the future. I do want to point out some points in the past. Okay, so here's one. That's when Olivier wrote his book, finished his book. So R is big negative, looks good for Olivier. Okay, he writes the preface. Okay, R is now positive, but pretty small, way less than G. So 0.5%, G is 2.2%. Here's the where he writes his blog post, okay? And it still looks good, but the recent past has not been kind to his preface and to his book. Who knows where it will go going forward, but it doesn't look so good. But I want to focus on two other points. Here's where Larry gave his speech at the fund, his ARC speech at the fund. And the real interest rate was relatively low, but it had come off from a big negative number, less than 1%, way less than the growth rate. Here's the key thing. Here's where Ken wrote his 2015, he gave a speech, he wrote it up, and it was recorded and then published eventually in 2016. He gave that speech when the real interest rate was 0, way less than the growth rate. So he gets, as far as I'm concerned, massive points, or when the chips are against him and the data doesn't look like it's in his favor, he's saying, this is transient, just wait. And of course, the data has come to him. So he gets big points for that. But let me just remind you, if G is 2.2%, which it is right now, and R is 2.2%, there's no difference between R and G. And if anything, we think that the real interest rate, with reasonable probability, might rise. Okay, so Summers doesn't believe in secular stagnation. Blanchard does. How about the rest of the world? I guess my view is there's just waning interest in secular stagnation. I think that the motivation was contrived. Here's what Google says. If you look actually at Google Trends worldwide, okay, for the query secular stagnation, of course it rose dramatically when Larry gave his speech, and it peaked shortly afterwards, and it's just been a steady downward trend afterwards. Okay, so what's the value added of this paper? Okay, here's what I'm going to say is easy. It's easy to say what the paper isn't. Okay, it isn't new theory. And it's not like Ken can't do it. He's the father of new open economy macroeconomics. Okay, it's not new data. Okay, and again, he's the creator of long historical series on prices, exchange rates, interest rates, debt statistics. It's not new methodology. Okay, it's not new empirical results. There are only 5 graphs in the version that was planted. Okay. And in fact, it's not really even a fair horse race between 2 competing hypotheses. Okay, here's what my view is. This is like a mashup of Ken's greatest hits. Volume 2, because there's a volume 1 beforehand that we won't go into. And there's a strong element of self-congratulation inside. Completely deserved, but he wants it acknowledged. Okay. And he has to flesh out the argument, so the paper does sprawl all over the place. Here's what it includes, at the very least. It uses the long historical data on debt from his work with Reinhardt and others. This time is different. It uses the long historical interest rate data, as been mentioned repeatedly. It uses, at least in passing, the argument that physical cash currency has to go. Now, he didn't spend much time on that in the presentation, but the idea is if there's no cash, there's no reason why nominal interest rates can't go big and negative to deal with countercyclical monetary policy. That's his book, The Curse of Cash. Okay. It's also connected to his recent work on Chinese real estate and banking fragility. Okay. It's also associated with his AI optimism that goes back 15 years. Okay. So the key to me is that there are many old self-citations so that he can say completely reasonably and justifiably, I told you all this years and years ago, and there are publications for it. So Ken was the perfect person, probably the only person, who could actually write this. No one else has the span of relevant and quite definitive original research, okay? And I gotta say, I really admired this. As you all know, chess is a big deal. Ken is a grandmaster. You want to see the grandmaster at work? You might not have picked up on it, but he said, just and briefly, Rose and John. He gave a throwaway citation to me orally, and he actually writes He gives me a citation that's completely shameless. He planted a throwaway citation because he knew I was going to be a discussant to a paper that's completely irrelevant. So it's really hard to argue with a guy like that. Okay. I will say in passing, it's not all a victory lap. Okay, so the facts seem to be moving completely consistently with his argument, but the title of the papers are moving the other way. The 2015 paper, which is very similar, is titled Debt Supercycle, Not Secular Stagnation. This one is Debt Supercycle versus Secular Stagnation. So in 9 years in the future, it might be debt supercycle and secular stagnation. I mean, who knows? Okay. A peripheral disagreement. Okay, is AI going to rescue growth? Okay, so I was really happy to learn from Artur's work that was presented yesterday that we really don't know that much. But nevertheless, I did investigate, and I asked ChatGPT-4, it was before 40 came out, my query was produce one PowerPoint slide, and I really wanted a slide, explaining why artificial intelligence will raise GDP growth. And here's what I got, okay, and this is ChatGPT. Here's a concise explanation, and I didn't get a PowerPoint slide, and I just got meaningless tripe. So when I, as a business school dean, see a reference to any research by McKinsey, which I do here, I just know I should just ignore it. So, I do believe in this particular case, less is more. I think that the AI optimism that's expressed in the paper, and to some extent in the presentation, is just a distraction here. The argument is about R minus G, which is currently 0. Most of the focus is on the interest rate, and that's completely reasonable. I just don't think we have to spend much time on the very unknown and dubious effect of AI on G. It only undermines the argument a little. If Ken really wanted to pursue it, he'd have to quantify the magnitudes, and there's just no reason to go there. Okay, let me close. Okay, there's a story. It might be apocryphal, but probably true. It's set at a fraternity at Yale. Okay, so at Yale, there's a distribution requirement if you want to graduate with a bachelor's degree. Okay, you have to take one course at least in many different areas, and one of them is in the hard sciences. If you're in social sciences, you have to take something in physics, chemistry, whatever. So a guy finds a course in astronomy, and the only requirement is one essay at the end of the semester. So this guy writes an essay on whatever it is, hands it in, gets an A. Okay, he gets the essay back, he leaves the fraternity, but next year, of course, the essay is floating around. Another person has the same issue. They need a distribution requirement. They need an essay, or they need a course, so they take the same astronomy course, hand in the same essay, comes back a few weeks later with an A. Okay. Third year comes around. Another person has to satisfy the distribution requirement, uses the essay, hands it in, and it comes back still worth an A. That's my view here. This paper is still worth an A. It's a combination of different strands of the literature. They all point to the same argument, which is debt supercycle is much more plausible than secular stagnation. It's a summation of a long and very influential research program connected by Ken's considerable span of research. He wins most of his arguments, and he's won this one too, as far as I'm concerned. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Rose. I invite Professor Rose, Professor Sumit AGARWAL, and together with Professor Laura ALFARO back on stage for the panel session, please.
Ken, thank you for a great talk. And generally, when I go to, presentations and we invite discussants, I like to see some rebuttals, some, criticism. In this sense, I found both discussants to completely agree with Ken. I still would like Ken a chance to come back, especially to Andy, who was saying great estates, self-congratulatory, and he went on and on criticizing. Ken, I think you deserve a chance to tell Andy and set the record straight.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to both Laura and Andy for the great discussions. Point one on Andy, read our AER paper. You're the most prominently cited paper. I simply repeated that citation in this paper. If I was only going to cite one paper, that was it. We replicate your results in the appendix. I mean, I don't know what more I can say. I would say, you say, who's on the other side? And I don't know how to say this gently, so I won't. You've been a dean for a while. And I think if you're reading the journals and going to economic seminars and seeing what the literature was, it may puzzle you that all the young people are secular stagnation, like many things about young people, puzzle people our age, but it is absolutely overwhelming. I could give you particularly in explaining the global factors in the U.S. I did, many papers. Stock and Watson, have a paper, but so I see a parade of papers coming through. And Laura, thank you. Actually, I don't know what data you were downloading exactly, because I'm not sure the way Paul formed inflation expectations and his thesis was, I'll just say, different. And so our real interest rate series in our paper, and we'd be happy to share them with you. We're posting it. I'm just not sure. I didn't know if it actually didn't realize it went up yet. It's wonderful if it did. So I won't, if you look at the United States and do like a Mueller-Watson or something, you come up with 1.5 to 1.75. But obviously Japan is not giving you that, although I didn't talk about Japan. There's a lot to be said. And Europe's, in big trouble. So anyway, otherwise, thank you so much.